From the Digital Media Center, on the campus of Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. This is Ramping Up Your English, an educational program for intermediate-level English language learners. Here's your host for Ramping Up Your English, John Letts.
Welcome to Ramping Up Your English. I'm John Letts, and this is episode 115. We continue our thematic unit on Native Americans, and today we're getting a little bit closer to home with each episode we do. We're looking at Native Americans, this time in the state of Oregon, and that is the theme of the featured video in today's episode. Let's watch.
The Columbia River cuts through the Cascade Mountains and carries an unbelievable amount of water to the ocean. A traveler on the river passes through varied and unforgettable landscapes. This river spans British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon states and flows into the Pacific Ocean. Given birth in the ice fields of Canada, the Columbia carries melted snow northwestward, then cooks at almost 180 degrees, coursing south toward the border with the United States. It continues south through Washington, following the approximate path of the cataclysmic Missoula flood that stripped central Washington of its soil, leaving scablands. It then turns west, coursing the Columbia Plateau and forming the border between Washington and Oregon. The beauty of the Columbia River itself seems to transport a traveler from misty reality to a mystical fantasy. At least that's so at the western end, where copious rainfall mixes with Mount Hood snowmelt to feed even more water into the river. All along the Columbia River Gorge, towering waterfalls feed the great river. The words beautiful and gorgeous are often used when describing this stream, but the most applied adjective is mighty. At the Columbia River Gorge, a great and abrupt transition occurs, from lush forests to dry, rocky terrain. Vital to the indigenous people who lived here were the salmon, providing essential protein to their diets, and spiritual life of equal importance. Hovering above the horizon of the Columbia River, Mount Hood holds special significance to Oregon's indigenous people. What can't be seen here are Cellio Falls. It's far below the surface, flooded by the Dalles Dam. If we could go back in time, Cellio Falls would look very different. Upriver from the ocean, this was the site of the great salmon fishery. The Columbia River narrows here as it approaches the Columbia River Gorge, producing a bottleneck through which millions of salmon swam on their great spawning migrations. 15 to 20 million salmon used to pass through here. Pat McMillan of the Fable Museum in Klamath Falls explains how the geography of the river gave birth to this great harvest of salmon.
It was squeezed off just at the place called the Long Narrows, and that was all rocky just before you entered the gorge. And so that was an area where they, fished easily, basically, because they could catch the fish right off the rocks.
Cellio Falls and the Dalles were also the border between Chinookian and Sahaptian-speaking peoples. This was the easternmost area of habitation by Chinookian speakers. Cellio was the oldest continuously inhabited community on the North American continent. Native American visitors came from all around to trade for goods, stories, and relations. Trade goods from the American Southwest, Great Plains, and Alaska found their way here as a major hub of an extensive trade network. Some historians call Cellio Falls the Wall Street of the West. The Wishram people lived on the north bank, while the Wasco lived on the south bank. Curator Pat McMillan of the Fable Museum in Klamath Falls describes the regional role played by Cellio Falls for some 15,000 years.
The fish run up in the Columbia River, when the fish would be spawning and they would come up the river, thousands of Indians from all over the coast, the Northwest, Washington, Idaho, the Klamath Indians here, they would go up to the Columbia River and fish.
The Corps of Discovery was not the first to contact the Indians belonging to the Chinook culture. U.S. Captain Robert Gray and British Captain George Vancouver both traded with Chinook when they entered the Columbia River. This trade was warmly welcome, as were the crew members. But the contact caused deadly disease among the Chinook tribes, and the death toll horrendous. Lewis and Clark noted the lack of people in villages that lined the river when they made their journey to this part of America. Lewis and Clark did find another concentration of people harvesting salmon, this time at Willamette Falls, where various villages claimed their fishing spots, some of them living permanently at the falls. The Corps of Discovery found the Columbia River from here to the coast was dominated by the Chinook people. As accomplished boatmen, the Chinook controlled the trade on the lower Columbia River. They were a powerful people, but this region was characterized by peace, not war. Chinook lived in clan houses made of cedar planks. This was home to extended families. Work specialization occurred here, with members creating various utilitarian and artistic objects and relating history and cultural values through storytelling. Social hierarchy was established at a young age. Infants of upper class developed flattened craniums, marking them as being atop the social ladder. Chinookian language formed the core of the Chinook trade jargon, incorporating French and English vocabulary. It was widely used in the region of various mutually unintelligible languages and dialects. The Chinook created distinctive canoes, a skill at which some members excelled. Following a life of living with and in canoes, the deceased were laid to rest in burial canoes. While the area inhabited by the Chinook was not extensive, their power and influence was widespread. Lewis and Clark found Chinook leaders eager to foster peace with them. They offered gifts of food, while Lewis and Clark gave them peace medals with the likeness of President Jefferson. The travels of the Corps of Discovery were followed by fur traders, establishing a fort at Astoria, and later by the Hudson Bay Company, building Fort Nez Perce and Fort Vancouver as the southern terminus of the York Factory Express. From Fort Vancouver came a new system of trade, with company men fanning out in the region, establishing trade in beaver pelts with tribes in Oregon Territory and Northern California. England and the United States agreed to a joint occupation of Oregon country, reaching from the 54th parallel to Mexico's Alta California. During this joint occupation, trader Jedediah Smith from the United States entered today's coastal Oregon. When a hatchet went missing, Smith's men beat and humiliated a chief of the Umpqua. This disproportionate punishment was met by the killing of most of Smith's party. Smith himself escaped to Fort Vancouver. Also during this joint occupation, settlers from the United States headed to Oregon for free land. Once South Pass became widely known, a trickle and then a flood of settlers invaded American Indian land in Oregon. Getting around Mount Hood was another ordeal for immigrants on the Oregon Trail, but they had high motivation to tackle yet another challenge. There was free land in the fertile Willamette Valley, but it was already occupied by communities known collectively as the Kalapuya. Ancient cataclysmic floods left this area extremely fertile, and it was here that most settlers made their claims. In today's state of Oregon, the Cascade Mountains and the Coast Range form borders between various indigenous groups, with those along the coast living in numerous small territories. East of the Cascades, tribes controlled larger swaths of land. Between these mountain ranges live the Kalapuya. From near the Columbia River in the north to the Umpqua River in the south, small independent Kalapuyan communities inhabited this country, much of it along the Willamette River and the Willamette River watershed. While they inhabited permanent settlements, some Kalapuyans traveled to gather food and reeds for basket making as well as hunting. Sometimes they raided neighbors for slaves. The Kalapuya suffered great loss of population due to malaria and smallpox spread accidentally by European and Euro-American traders, missionaries, and others. This reduced their population from an estimated 15,000 to about 600. In 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya signed treaties that had them lose virtually all their land, including the Kalapuya Mountains. Those who survived the diseases were moved to the Grand Ronde Reservation, where they had to live with those of other tribes and languages. They coped by speaking the Chinook trade jargon. Far south from Cellio Falls in Oregon, the Klamath Basin holds expansive lakes and other wetlands. Upper Klamath Lake is the largest lake in Oregon and holds resources that are important to the people who live there. This region held many more lakes in the past, most of them dried up today. That's the case with Paisley Caves, where the oldest human DNA in America has been discovered. A number of artifacts have been uncovered and researched. They tell us of human inhabitation that goes back before Mount Mazama erupted over 7,000 years ago. Pat McMillan says these people must have witnessed this explosive event.
That occurred about 7,000 years ago, the eruption of Mount Mazama. And in the Cougar Mountain Cave documentation, when it was excavated and documented, there are levels that tell at what was happening. The soil radiation, you can date things very closely as to what their time frame was. And there were people here living at the time of the eruption of Mount Mazama. And they used that, and I know that it's still in use. They trekked there for special occasions. The shaman went there for various things, and it was a very special area for them once it became Crater Lake.
Things left behind by early Klamath Basin inhabitants tells us much about how they lived. Pat McMillan relates how people who moved around every year to hunt and gather handled their not-so-portable possessions.
The interesting thing about the tools here, the metates, were all heavy rock. And so when the Indians were here, for example, fishing along the river, they would catch the fish and dry them. And the woman, of course, would be preparing food for their stay here. But when they got ready to go on to the next food gathering place, the women would bury their stones here and move on to the next place where they had other stones prepared. So it was a great relief to me to know that they weren't carrying those heavy rocks. But anyway, we have so many here because the Klamath Indians lived up at the north end of the Little Link River, and the Modocs down at this end where the museum is. And when the museum was being built, they were excavating for the foundation, and they kept turning up these rocks.
Stone metates weren't the only things left to be discovered thousands of years later. Pat McMillan explains.
Well, the interesting thing I think about the textiles that are in this area, Cougar Mountain Cave and then the Catlow Valley Cave, the other exhibit, they are the basketry for the flat mats and the bowls and that sort of thing are all done by the twining method. And twining comes about from the tules that grow along the lake bed, and they dry them and peel them, and it is really done with the peeled part of the tule.
Just east of the Cascade Mountains in southern Oregon, the Klamath tribe lived in a rain shadow. Most precipitation fell west of the Cascades. That's surprising because lakes were plentiful, even in the high country. From mountain lakes to sprawling forests to vast wetlands, the Klamath Basin sustained these people for thousands of years. There was no lack of beauty here, nor want of appreciation. Abundant forests provided elk, deer, bear, and many other wild animals. Beavers and river otters inhabited the lakes, as they do today. The staple food for the Klamath was the fish that inhabited Upper Klamath Lake.
The Chwam and Koptu are found only in the Upper Klamath Basin, nowhere else in the world and probably the universe, which means they're endemic, which means they're uniquely adapted to this particular environment.
I remember these banks were lined with our people catching the fish, preparing them, cooking them on the fire, eating them.
You must always remember to give thanks for this fish.
The tule was one of the gifts that enriched their lives, from baskets and mats to their houses. Pat McMillan explains how the Klamath moved through their world on seasonal rounds.
The Native Americans stayed here until the fish run was basically over, or they had all they needed, but they were so aware of the seasons of change and what grew during that particular portion of the year, they would know where the next gathering place was. It might be berries, it might be roots, it might be any number of things that were important to them, which in this case is wokus, which is the water lily that grows on all of these lakes around here, which makes sense because that was one of their main foods.
There were 6 tribes of the Klamath, all living in independent communities, yet bound to each other by language, religion, culture, and family ties. In 1826, traders from Fort Vancouver became the first whites encountered by the Klamath tribes. Encounters with the United States were not so peaceful. John Fremont and Kit Carson executed an encampment of Klamath families, blaming them for a nighttime raid which they had nothing to do with. By 1864, the trickle of white explorers and traders became a flood of white settlers. Efforts to make them leave were unsuccessful, and the pressure resulted in the Klamath ceding 23 million acres to the U.S. government. This was not the end of land lost to the United States. The Klamath had success in ranching and forest management, including timber operations. And while this brought them prosperity, it also put them on top of the list for being dissolved as a tribe. The 1953 Termination Act severed tribal bonds with the U.S. government, ending all support they were receiving. As news reporter, later turned Governor Tom McCall found, Klamath people were divided in their reaction to the termination policy.
The current of doubt and conflict brought on by termination and its effort, involving massive economic, social, and legislative problems. 15,000 acres of wildfowl habitat, along the shores of which the Klamath's ancestors pitched their hogans while they harvested the wokus and the eggs of the mud hen, the honker, and the mallard. The land, the trees, and the marsh, these are three of the main elements of crisis in the Klamath Basin. A crisis brought to a head by congressional passage of Public Law 587 in 1954 to terminate nearly 100 years of federal trusteeship over the Klamath Indians.
Twice the approval of termination was put to a vote, and twice the majority of Klamath Indians rejected it. Yet it didn't matter what the tribal members wanted. Congress had acted, and in 1954, the Klamath became the first tribe terminated by the new policy.
I felt that at that time, that rather than termination of federal supervision, that the Indians should be given the right to handle their own property the way they wanted to handle it.
1,600 Klamaths withdrew from the tribe for payment in land. The reservation shrunk from 762,000 to 145,000 acres. Most went to a timber company, and the rest became the Wainema and Fremont National Forests.
Are you happy with termination? No.
This was a disaster for most Klamath people, with poverty, alcoholism, suicide, and infant mortality increased, and life expectancy decreased. Not until 1986 were the Klamath restored as a sovereign state, yet the land that had been the source of earlier prosperity was not returned. Nonetheless, the restoration had deep significance to the Klamath.
Once that nucleus was put back into our hearts, then the tribe started moving forward towards making plans for restoration.
Now the Klamath are joined with the Modoc and the Yahuskan band of the Paiutes as a single tribe. The Klamath were not alone in being terminated and fighting to be restored, and losing more land in the process. Various tribes in Oregon were affected in this way and exist today as confederated tribes, including the Umatilla, Siletz, Grand Ronde, and Warm Springs. Oregon's Native Americans reserve the rights to hunt and fish in the usual and customary places. This included Cellio Falls, where they exercised this treaty right. Well into the 20th century, people continued to congregate at Cellio Falls during the spawning migration of the salmon. While the people kept coming, fewer and fewer salmon arrived. Activities by whites, including railroad construction, reduced the number of salmon on the river. Constructed during the Great Depression and opened in 1938, the Bonneville Dam impeded migrating salmon. More dams followed, facilitating navigation, flood control, and providing electricity that was needed for the war effort. Fish ladders were constructed to help migrating salmon get around the dams and to get to and from spawning grounds. This allowed some salmon to pass through, but the salmon numbers continued to diminish. That didn't keep people away from Cellio Falls. Native and non-native continued the millennial-old tradition. Cellio Falls continued to be a busy place during the spawning migration, yet changes did come with newcomers. The greatest change was explosive and traumatic. In 1957, Cellio Falls was flooded by construction of the Dalles Dam. All that's left of the once busy hub of the American Indian Trade Network is Cellio Village. Only a few people live here today, making a living by fishing, yet very different in scale and methods. More dams came later, turning the once roiling Columbia River into a series of calm impoundments, called lakes today. There are now 60 dams in the Columbia River watershed. A series of locks allows river traffic to reach the inland ports of Lewiston, Idaho, carrying wheat and lumber to markets further west. The amount of hydroelectric power generated is staggering, as are the effects on salmon and the people who depend on them. The Klamath once made journeys up to Cellio Falls. Now they focus on fish in their own region. They are very involved in critical water issues and in supporting the removal of 4 dams on the Klamath River. With a long and varied past and a challenging present, I asked Pat McMillan a most challenging question about the Klamath.
The question is, when it comes to the future, with all this background you have of the past and the present for the Native people who live in Southern Oregon, what to you looks like a possible future?
Well, what I have observed with the Klamath tribes is their desire to pass along their history to their children. And that has been a big focus of the tribal's energy. And so the learning of the language is one. They have youth camps in the summertime to teach bow making, arrowhead making, various types of tools that they used back in the olden days, historically. And so I feel that they're going to be very well-rounded. They're going to have respect for their past, and then they're going to be looking to the future of how they can work, with the general population, if you want to say that way. I think that they're making some inroads there, and I'm very excited to see that, because some of their tribal customs are very, very interesting, and how they perceived various parts of the universe, and how they taught their children to become independent. And so I think those were, certainly things that could be emulated today.
And with that, we end episode 115 of Ramping Up Your English. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope you'll be watching next time for our next episode of Ramping Up Your English. I'm John Letts.
You've been watching Ramping Up Your English, a support program for intermediate-level English language learners. Learn more. Visit our website at letscreate.org. You can also watch or download today's program at archive.org/details/roguetv. Join us next time on RBTV Voices for Ramping Up Your English.